What's up, everybody? Welcome to Fed by Fire. I'm Christian Whitlow. Today, we're going to talk about every time the feds have kicked my door down or somebody's door that I was behind. From the time I was 5 years old until I was 25. We're going to go through it all, and some of these stories are funny, and looking back, some of them were terrifying, and all of them, taught me something that we're also going to break down, how these investigations usually start, what has to happen before a judge signs a search warrant, and why federal cases are often built for months or even years before anybody ever hears a knock at the door. We're going to get into all of it. But the first one happened to me when I was about 5 years old. I don't remember every detail, but, because, I was just a kid, but I remember enough. And that's why it's always stuck with me. You know, my mom and dad, they were having an argument. And, from everything I've been told over the years, my dad barricaded himself inside, and he even filled up the bathtub first. They filled it with mace, but he thought that he was gonna have to hold off the cops or something. Then he noticed a little red dot on his chest, and it was a laser. And at that moment, he realized that there were rifles pointed at him, and he decided to give it up. It was over. And this was my introduction to law enforcement. you know they were in their the gear too. you know there were a couple more searches after that, while I was growing up, but nothing that really stood out the way that this next one did. So by this time, I was around 14 years old, and I thought I knew everything in the world. I was hanging around older people, skipping school. I thought I was the shit, making terrible decisions and living a life that honestly I thought was normal because it was all I really ever known at the time. And one morning we're sitting there just chilling in my apartment when somebody notices a plainclothes officer because they can see the badge hanging from the necklace. And the second we saw them, everybody starts scrambling. And, people start panicking. And without getting into every single detail, anything that could have, gotten people in a serious amount of trouble, we made it disappear as fast as everybody could make it disappear. And we even had to stuff a lot in the VCR, one of the black ones, those big black giant televisions, and they didn't find it. And we thought nobody would ever look there. Good thing they didn't. And the crazy part is, we'd spend the entire day before that packing because we were getting ready to move. And every box we owned was taped. It was all ready to go, shut and stacked around the apartment. And when the search started, they, of course, proceeded to dump it all on the ground, every single one of those boxes onto the floor. And by the time they finished, it looked like a tornado had ripped through the place. Clothes everywhere, dishes, family pictures, everything was a mess. It was scattered everywhere. But, that's the kind of thing I wouldn't expect much different from them. But at the end of the day, they only found a bottle outside that came back with minerals of dirt once, they sent it off, but it came back with nothing. And eventually they saw my mom at court and apologized. And, that it wasn't what they thought it was. And one thing I've always thought was very strange that they completely overlooked, other things that were sitting out in the open. Looking back, they probably should have raised a lot more questions but didn't. It just goes to show you that investigations don't always play out the way people think they do. Somehow the you know they ended up at our apartment in the first place. Let's talk about it. From what I understand, my mom had lost a storage unit, and you know some people had access to it, her, my sister and the guy she was dating, and inside investigators found trash. I'm not going to say what kind of trash, you can leave it up to the imagination, but very suspicious trash. And it got their attention and eventually led them to our front door. As for me, I absolutely lost my mind, trying to show off. I was supposed to be at school that day, but instead I was hanging out with all my older homies, trying to act like I was somebody. I started cussing them out. I stripped down to my boxers. I was stealing my mom's cigarettes, smoking them right in front of them and acting, just completely reckless because I thought, I had something to prove when I really shouldn't have. Looking back now, I realized that I was just a scared 14-year-old trying to look tough in front of people whose opinions, didn't really matter anyway. The funny part is, after all that chaos, the only charge I caught that day was underage possession of tobacco. But, that was the very first charge that I ever received. Looking back now, I, don't tell this story because I'm proud of it. I tell it because, it reminds me just how normal chaos had become to me. And, when you grow up around that kind of lifestyle, you stop realizing how crazy it really is. It isn't until years later, years after the fact, years after you've changed your life, that you can look back and, see just how close you were to throwing your entire life away before it ever really even started. This next story happened a few years later, and by this point, my life had gotten a whole lot darker. I was living, in what most people would call in the street a shooting gallery. And if you have ever heard the term before, it's basically a house or an apartment where people come to use substances. It's usually run down, chaotic, and full of people coming and going at all hours. And, addiction has taken over everything in the place. Nobody there is living a normal life anymore. The house, is dirty as fuck. People are sick. You can't trust anybody. Nobody trusts anybody. And, you're just trying to make it to the next day. And that's what it was. So, the woman who lived there with us, I'll call her C. She had a habit that always stuck with me that I can never get out of my memory. She collected used syringes, you know, I'm not exaggerating here. She treated them the way a lot of people collect, bowls or bongs or pipes. She didn't want to throw any away. Hers, yours, mine, and everybody else's, it didn't matter. And if you didn't give them to her, she would steal them. There were used needles everywhere, every drawer, every table, every corner of that house seemed to have another one, and that day, the girl I was with, me and her had been laying in the bed, sick. We hadn't had nothing. We felt terrible. And normally we'd wedge a long steel bar between the wall and the door before we went to sleep, but we didn't this time. And it looked like it was something off of a tractor trailer. And once it was in place, nobody was getting through that door. There had actually even been another time when, emergency responders couldn't get through the door because of that breaker bar. And, they had to find another way in, and they came in through the window of the third story apartment. But, this time we had forgot. The next thing I know, we're getting pulled out into the hallway, getting pulled out of bed. I'm naked, I'm sick, and, I'm getting dragged out into a hallway by my head while, officers secured the apartment. It all happened, really fast. I barely had time, to figure out what was going on, but they eventually brought me some clothes out. And once everything had settled down, they had his handcuffs sitting outside in the hallway. And while they searched the house, what I'll never forget is this, that search actually, they slowed down and had to stop because there was so many used needles scattered throughout the apartment. Every room had another hazard. Every time they moved something, there seemed to be, another one falling out behind it, or underneath it. It was a sketchy place. But while we're sitting there in cuffs, I'm trying to watch the girl I was with because I didn't know how she was going to take it either. And I didn't know what either of them were going to say, if they were going to say anything they'd regret. At the same time, the investigators were doing what investigators often do during interviews. They were trying to turn us against each other, telling us that they knew everything, saying that they'd been watching the place, and trying to convince us that the case was already solved, when really I don't think they had all that. The warrant said, that investigators believed illegal activity had been taking place there and that there had been a buy done the day before the search. But sitting there listening to them, it felt like, they knew far more than they actually did. Because looking back, I realized part of that was likely, just an interview tactic to see if anybody would start folding. They even tried to recruit one of us as, cooperating with the investigation. And one thing that still makes me laugh is, it what happened is, I pulled out my needle exchange card thinking it was going to help something, thinking that, the thing that says I'm part of the exchange program. And so I showed it to them, and, they basically laughed that shit off like it was nothing. But, you know, I thought it helped something. And one of the officers looked at it and was like, I'd go to these exchanges all the time. They're not like that, but whatever. After everything, the search, the questioning, the hours of sitting in the hallway in handcuffs, nothing came of it. For me, and looking back now, I don't remember, that day because I got away with something. I remember it because I thought that house was, normal. I thought it was a place, it was a place though, covered in nasty stuff, people sleeping through withdrawals, and, search warrants becoming just another day of the week. And, that's what addiction will do to you. It convinces you that, complete chaos is just everyday life. And, the next one is one of those situations that, could have gone completely left in a lot of different ways. So it started, like a normal day, as in addiction, which, in itself says a lot about that life. You know, we were making bad decisions as always, doing what we had to do to survive. And, we had enough money to go see our friend. And, the guy that we wanted to see, the guy that was with us, he was trying to, he kept trying to get our friend to go to another hotel room, and we were at a place that was 200 feet away. And the hotel he wanted to go to was like 200 feet away. So they convinced him to go back to the hotel. And, without realizing it, I'm pretty sure the place was already under surveillance. So we walk in the room, and, not even a couple minutes pass before it happens. Bang, bang, bang. Search warrant. Police open up. They're at both sides of the door. They're at the regular door, and then this hotel had a sliding glass door. So the dude I was there to hang out with, he had a warrant. For a split second, you could feel everybody trying to process what was happening. But at the same time, nobody was thinking clearly at all. It was basically pure shock. And, it was the kind of moment where your brain is trying to catch up with reality. And the officers came in fast, they controlled it quick, they, you know, see that we had him in under some clothes, and his brother's in the room, so we try to make him think that they got the wrong guy. And there's a short window where everybody's trying to talk and explain, and trying to talk about the situation. But me and my girl just sitting there, and we're watching it all unfold, and it gets quiet for a second, and he loses his position, and they find him. And it was a crazy time. This could have easily turned into something way worse, for everybody in that room. At one point, I remember hearing the officers talking after they had my friend in custody over the radio, asking whether they wanted to fully search the room or just secure it and move on. And there was a canine right there patting, like waiting, and you could feel how quickly things were escalating depending on what the next decision was. And when the answer came back, they had other priorities, that they had other shit to do, that they were gonna just grab and go, take him and leave. And just like that, it was over. And looking back, what sticks with me isn't, the arrest. It isn't what happened. It's how close that situation was to turning into something completely worse. Wrong place, wrong timing, wrong people. And that's what it always comes down to. And suddenly, all those things add up, and you're sitting in the middle of something that you had nothing to do with, but still could have gotten caught up in it. All right, that's the part, that we can't forget. Not because anything happened to me, but, because it easily could have. Now, let's talk about how the average person ends up in this situation. Because, despite what Hollywood tells you, federal agents usually don't just wake up one morning and, decide. It takes a lot of preparation before kicking somebody's door in. And most investigations start with something very small. Some suspicious activity, could be a traffic stop, a tip, or commonly an informant, or just a complaint from a neighbor, or financial activity. It could be a lot of things, but they gather evidence for the investigation, or somebody's already facing charges, who's decided to cooperate. Everybody's situation is different, but one piece of information leads to another, and investigators start putting it all together. They put together a timeline, and from there, they try to verify what they've been told. That can involve a lot of surveillance, reviewing records, and all that they can legally obtain. And they try to obtain controlled purchases. In some cases, interviews. They analyze electronic evidence like phone data, when authorized, they are also following the money trails, and they're looking for evidence that supports or disproves the information that they already have. And the goal is to build, enough probable cause to convince the judge that, there's a reasonable basis that they believe there's a crime here and that they found in this particular place to be able to get a search warrant. And that's an important point. A search warrant isn't supposed to be based on a bunch of investigators, on a hunch. It's supposed to be presented with facts to a judge, and if the judge believes those facts establish probable cause, the warrant will be signed. And, the warrant also describes, where officers are allowed to search and what they're specifically looking for. Another thing people don't realize is that many investigations take months, years, and in larger cases, investigators may spend a long time gathering evidence before making any type of arrest. There's often been they try to understand the full picture, identify everyone involved, and document what they can before taking action. And by the time, you hear someone say, the feds kicked in my door, there's usually a long story that happened before that moment. And, the search warrant itself is often the end of, one phase of an investigation, not the beginning. And that's, one of the biggest lessons that I've learned looking back is, the door getting kicked in isn't where the case starts. Most of the time, it's where months and months and months of investigative work finally come to a head and become visible. Now, let's talk about the difference between the feds and your local task force, because a lot of people use those terms like, they're the same thing, and most of the time they do work hand in hand, but they're not the same thing. And when people say the feds kicked in my door, they usually picture FBI, DEA, ATF, US Marshals, one of them. And sometimes that's exactly what happened, but a lot of the time what people are actually dealing with is a local or regional task force made up of officers from different agencies working together, as one. A task force, might include city police, town police, sheriff's office, the state police, and, federal agents as well, all working in conjunction, all on the same investigation. Everybody, has a different role, but, they're sharing information and working towards the same goal. So even, if your front door gets hit by officers wearing local uniforms, they may still be part of a federal agency behind the investigation. One of the biggest differences is what they're trying to accomplish. Your local police, your local police department is usually focused on crimes happening in their city or county. They're responding to calls, making arrests, and investigating offenses that affect, their community. And they affect their communities on an everyday basis, and federal agencies are often looking at the bigger picture, the bigger fish. Instead of one arrest, they may be trying to identify an entire organization, trace money, connect multiple jurisdictions, and build conspiracy cases that stretch across multiple states. That's how they roll. And that's one reason federal investigations can take so much more time. And, before anyone even gets arrested. Another thing that people don't realize is, that just because federal agents are involved, it doesn't automatically mean you'll end up in federal court. Sometimes it's a joint investigation and it still results in state charges. In other cases, federal prosecutors decide whether the evidence supports federal charges instead, but it depends on the facts of the case and, the laws that are involved, where you are and which prosecutors take it forward. And, there's something that has surprised me, when I've gotten older. The people serving the warrant aren't always, the people who spent months building the case. You know, it's a lot of building blocks to build an investigation. The officers at your door may just be part of a team executing the search warrant. The detectives, the analysts, or the agents who built the case may have been, working behind the scenes to bring this together and for a long time. And that's why I tell people not to judge an investigation by what they see during those first few minutes, when the door comes open. But, by then a lot of work has been done already, and a lot of shit has already happened that nobody on the outside ever saw. And we're at the end of this video. If you've made it to this point, like and subscribe. I appreciate you guys being here. But if you want to avoid your door being kicked in, I have one piece of advice. Don't do illegal shit. Get a job, stay away from, that. If you're not into it, if you're already living that life, Godspeed. Your run will only be so long, and once you factor in the time you spend in prison, it's basically minimum wage. But I make these videos so maybe I can help someone out there and they can hear me. As always, I appreciate you guys for being here. Peace.